The Romans were stretched thin, fighting in unfamiliar desert terrain against an enemy who knew every rock and dune. Kushite forces harassed them constantly, supply lines became precarious, and Amanirenas showed no sign of surrendering. Eventually, both sides agreed to negotiate. In 20 BCE, Kushite ambassadors traveled to the Greek island of Samos, where Augustus himself was staying. The negotiations were surprisingly favorable to Kush. Rome agreed to withdraw from Nubian territory, reduce the tribute demanded, and respect Kush's independence. Why did Rome, the mightiest empire in the world, make peace on such generous terms? Because conquering Nubia wasn't worth the cost. The region was poor by Mediterranean standards, the terrain was hostile, and Nero had proven it could make Roman occupation very expensive. Amanirenas had achieved what few ancient rulers ever managed. She had fought Rome to a standstill. After the peace with Rome, Nero entered a long, slow decline. The kingdom remained independent and continued building pyramids, temples, and palaces, but the quality of construction gradually deteriorated. The later pyramids at Meroe are smaller, more crudely built, and show less artistic sophistication than earlier monuments. Several factors contributed to this decline. Trade routes shifted as the Red Sea became more important for Roman commerce, bypassing the Nile Valley. Environmental degradation, deforestation from iron smelting and overgrazing may have weakened the agricultural base. Political fragmentation seems to have occurred, with regional centers gaining independence from Mero's authority. But the final blow came from the south. The Kingdom of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, rose to power in the first centuries CE. Aksum controlled the Red Sea trade, had close ties with Rome, and was expanding westward into the Nile Valley. Around 350 CE, King Ezana of Aksum invaded Meroe. Aksumite inscriptions, written in Greek, describe a victorious campaign against the Noba and Kasu, the people of Nubia and Kush. The Aksumites burned towns, captured livestock, and destroyed Meroitic power. Meroe was abandoned. The great city fell silent. The pyramids stopped being built. The Meroitic script ceased to be written. After 3,000 years, the kingdom of Kush was no more. For 2,000 years, the story of the Black Pharaohs was hidden, forgotten, and when rediscovered, often misunderstood or downplayed. European scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries couldn't accept that black Africans had conquered Egypt. They invented elaborate theories to explain away the evidence. Some claimed the Kushite pharaohs weren't really black, but were Mediterranean people who had migrated to Nubia. Others argued that while the Kushites might have ruled Egypt briefly, they contributed nothing to Egyptian civilization. These racist theories persisted well into the 20th century. Even today, many people learn Egyptian history without ever hearing about the 25th dynasty. The Black Pharaohs have been written out of history books, omitted from museum exhibits, and marginalized in popular media. This erasure was deliberate. It served a narrative that presented African civilizations as primitive and suggested that any achievements in Africa must have come from outside influences, from Egypt, from Arabia, from anywhere but indigenous African peoples. The truth is that Kush was thoroughly African. Yes, it absorbed Egyptian culture, but Egypt itself had absorbed Nubian influences for millennia. The relationship was reciprocal, not one-directional, and the Kushites created their own distinctive civilization that outlasted Egypt itself. One of the most hidden aspects of Kushite history is the extraordinary power and status of women. In most ancient civilizations, women were subordinate to men, excluded from political power, and relegated to domestic roles. Kush was different. Kushite queens are ruled in their own right, not just as regions. They commanded armies, conducted diplomacy, and built monuments. The title Kandake was equivalent to king, not queen consort. These were sovereign rulers. Moreover, royal succession in Kush didn't always follow the male line. Brothers might succeed, brothers, nephews might succeed, uncles and sons might inherit from their mother's brothers rather than their fathers. This suggests a more complex kinship system than patrilineal succession, possibly with matrilineal elements. The Kandakes were depicted in royal art the same way male kings were, wearing the same crowns, holding the same symbols of power, performing the same rituals. Some reliefs show Kandakes smiting enemies, the traditional pharaonic pose of military dominance. This gender egalitarianism was rare in the ancient world and suggests that Kushite society had different values regarding women's roles than their Mediterranean neighbors. Another hidden element of Kushite history is the kingdom's deep connections to the African interior, connections that went far beyond Egypt or the Mediterranean world. Meroe, particularly, was oriented south and east, not north. The kingdom traded extensively with regions we now call South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and even further into Central Africa. Ivory, ebony, gold, iron, cattle, and enslaved people moved through Kushite trade networks, connecting the African interior to the wider world. Archaeological evidence shows that Meroe had contact with people from deep in Africa. Pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and the architectural features at Meroe show influences from sub-Saharan Africa, not just Egypt. The Meroitic language itself may have belonged to a Nilo-Saharan language family, linking it to languages spoken across the African Sahel, not to Mediterranean language families. In other words, Kush wasn't just a peripheral offshoot of Egyptian civilization. It was a major African kingdom in its own right, with its own cultural sphere, its own trade networks, and its own connections to the broader African continent. The religious life of Kush is often simplified as merely copying Egyptian religion. But the reality was more complex. Yes, Kushites worshipped Amun and other Egyptian gods, but they worshipped them differently. At Jebel Bakau, Amun was seen as a warrior god more than in Egypt. Kushite religious texts emphasize Amun's martial aspects and his role in legitimizing kingship through military victory. Kushites also worshipped local Nubian gods that Egyptians didn't recognize. Apedemak, a lion-headed warrior god unique to Kush, had temples throughout Meroe. Sebiumeka, another indigenous deity, appears in Meroitic inscriptions but not Egyptian texts. The Kushites synthesized Egyptian and Nubian religious traditions, creating something new. This religious synthesis parallels their cultural synthesis. They were neither purely Egyptian nor purely Nubian, but both and something more. Everyone knows about Egypt's pyramids. Almost no one knows that Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt, over 200 Kushite pyramids compared to around 120 Egyptian pyramids. The Kushite pyramids are different from Egyptian ones. They are smaller, steeper, and built differently. Kushite pyramids have angles of about 70 degrees compared to Egypt's 52 degrees. They are also later. Most were built between 300 BCE and 300 CE, long after Egyptian pyramid building had ceased. These pyramids contained the burials of kings, queens, and nobles. Inside were treasures, offerings, and inscriptions. Many were topped with offering chapels where rituals were performed. Today, these pyramids sit largely forgotten in the Sudanese desert. Some have been damaged by treasure hunters. Others are slowly eroding. But they stand as testament to a civilization that rivaled Egypt in power, wealth, and cultural achievement. The fall of Meroe didn't erase Kushite influence from Africa. On the contrary, the kingdom's legacy spread throughout northeastern Africa and beyond. When Meroe fell, its people didn't disappear. They migrated, merged with other populations, and carried their culture with them. The X-group culture and later the Christian Nubian kingdoms of Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia emerged in the same regions Kush had once controlled. These Christian Nubian kingdoms, which lasted from the 6th to the 15th centuries CE, maintained many Kushite traditions. They built churches on the sites of Kushite temples. They continued some artistic styles.